I still remember the exact moment it all began to unravel. I was sitting at home, flipping through TV channels, half listening to the low hum of the nightly news. My wife, Karen, was supposed to be at a corporate event across town, one of those fancy gatherings where everyone's dressed to the nines and pretends to be better friends than they really are. We'd been married for 6 years. I trusted her completely, until that night. It was nearing midnight when I realized I hadn't heard from her. Usually, she'd send me a quick text or give me a call, but tonight was radio silence. I tried calling her phone just to check in, expecting to hear her laugh and apologize for not updating me sooner. Instead, when the line finally picked up, it wasn't Karen on the other end. A man's voice, smooth, arrogant, and shockingly casual, said, "Hey, man, Karen's busy right now. We're having fun together, if you know what I mean. Don't call her again tonight, alright?" I froze, my mind struggling to process what I'd just heard. "Who the hell are you?" I demanded, anger already boiling up inside me. I could feel my pulse pounding in my temples, the disbelief quickly turning into fury. The man just chuckled, unfazed. "Relax. I'm Rob, her boss. She's with me tonight. Now, I don't want to be rude, but let her enjoy herself." Then he hung up. I was left standing there, gripping my phone, the walls around me closing in as realization sank in. My wife, my Karen, was with him. And he had the audacity to tell me to let her enjoy herself. I couldn't sleep that night. Rage, pain, and humiliation gnawed at me, keeping me wide awake. I thought of the nights Karen had stayed late at the office, the work trips she'd taken. I'd trusted her without question. Now, every little memory replayed in my mind, each one hinting at a lie I hadn't wanted to see. Around 2 a.m., I made a decision. I wasn't going to let her walk back in here like nothing had happened. I went to our closet, pulling out every single one of her designer dresses, her expensive shoes, and even the jewelry I'd bought for her over the years. I piled it all by the front door, my hands shaking with anger. By 3 a.m., I was done. Her entire wardrobe was packed, and I'd left a note on top, "I know everything. Get out." I sat on the couch, seething, waiting for her to come home and face me. I had a million things I wanted to scream at her. But as the hours passed, exhaustion took over, and I finally dozed off. When I woke up to the sound of keys jingling in the lock, it was already morning. The lock turned, and Karen walked in, oblivious to the storm that awaited her. I could tell from her disheveled appearance that she hadn't come straight home. Her perfectly styled blonde hair, which she normally kept neat and tidy, was now a mess, loose curls tumbling in a way that didn't look accidental. She wore a fitted black dress, the kind of thing you'd only put on if you were trying to impress someone. And her makeup, well, let's just say the smudged lipstick and smeared mascara painted a picture I didn't want to imagine but couldn't ignore. When she saw the boxes by the door, her face dropped. What is this, Mark?" she asked, her voice shaky, eyes darting from me to the piles of her things stacked near the exit. I sat on the couch, hands folded, feeling the weight of betrayal settling deeper in my chest. I wanted to scream at her, to demand answers, but I knew my silence would hit harder. She tried to laugh it off, her voice laced with that fake innocence that only made me angrier. "Is this some kind of joke?" she asked, taking a step toward me. "Go ahead, Karen," I said, my voice colder than I'd ever heard it. "Tell me why Rob answered your phone last night." I could see the blood drain from her face, her expression shifting from confusion to fear. She stammered, searching for words, but nothing came out. The Karen I knew had always been quick-witted, someone who could talk her way out of any situation. But now, she stood there, frozen, caught like a deer in headlights. "Oh, don't worry," I said, standing up slowly, feeling the anger bubble up inside me. "Rob was very honest. Said you were having fun together. Even had the nerve to tell me not to call you again." She swallowed hard, her eyes flicking down to the boxes. Her voice cracked. "Mark, it's not what you think. Please, let me explain." I laughed bitterly. "Oh, please do, Karen. Explain to me why my wife was spending the night with her boss. Tell me how many business trips were just an excuse to be with him. Enlighten me." She took a shaky breath, wringing her hands together, and for a second, I almost felt pity for her. Almost. She started to speak, her voice quiet, but I cut her off. "You know what? Forget it. I don't even want to know," I said, my voice rising. "You disrespected me in my own home. You humiliated me. And for what? To cozy up to your boss? Mark, it was a mistake. I swear, it didn't mean anything," she said, desperation clear in her voice. "Please. I'll do anything to make this right. Just let me stay. Let's talk about this. Please." I crossed my arms, looking at her with a mixture of disgust and disappointment. This woman, standing in front of me, wasn't the Karen I thought I knew. That Karen was loyal, kind, the type of woman who'd light up a room just by being in it. But the woman in front of me? She was a stranger. "Get out," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but each word felt heavy. "Mark, please," she pleaded, her voice breaking. Tears started streaming down her face, and for a moment, I almost faltered. Almost. But I forced myself to remember that phone call, the arrogance in Rob's voice, and the fact that she had chosen to betray me, to destroy everything we'd built together, for what? A cheap thrill? "You heard me," I said, gesturing to the door. "There's nothing left to talk about." She looked around, helpless, as if hoping someone would save her. Her eyes fell on the small photo on the shelf by the door, a picture of the two of us from our honeymoon in Hawaii, smiling and wrapped in each other's arms. Back then, I believed we were unbreakable, that our love was something no one could come between. Now, that photo felt like a cruel reminder of how naive I'd been. Slowly, Karen began to realize that I wasn't going to change my mind. Her shoulders slumped, and she grabbed a few of the boxes, staggering under their weight as she moved toward the door. She looked back one last time, her face etched with a mixture of sorrow and disbelief. "Mark," she whispered, voice trembling, "please, don't do this." I clenched my jaw, fighting back the sting of tears. "You did this, Karen. You did this." With one last look, she walked out, closing the door behind her. The silence that followed was deafening, and for a moment, I felt an overwhelming emptiness. This woman had been my partner, my confidant, the person I thought I'd spend my life with. And now, she was gone, taking with her every promise we'd ever made to each other. I collapsed onto the couch, feeling the weight of everything settle in. It was over. The life I'd thought we were building together had crumbled in an instant. And as much as I wanted to hate her, I couldn't shake the feeling of loss gnawing at my chest. But I knew one thing, there was no going back. I wasn't going to let her hurt me again. The house was unbearably silent after Karen left. I wandered around, my mind reeling, unable to settle. Every corner of the place reminded me of her, the scent of her perfume lingering in the bedroom, the wine glasses we'd used on countless evenings, her favorite throw blanket draped over the couch. Each item felt like a thorn, twisting deeper into the wounds she'd left behind. I tried distracting myself, throwing myself into work. I work in finance, and the one good thing about that line of work is it leaves little time to think about anything else. At the office, my colleagues didn't notice anything unusual. They saw the same hard-working, level-headed Mark, always prepared with the data, always organized. I kept my conversations surface level and avoided any mention of my personal life. I didn't want anyone to know, not yet. I wasn't ready for the pity or the prying questions. But no matter how much I tried to keep my focus, my thoughts kept drifting back to that night and the humiliation I'd endured. I knew I'd need someone to talk to eventually, someone who'd understand. That's when I reached out to my friend Dan. Dan and I had been friends since college. We'd been through breakups, job changes, and everything in between. He was a big guy, tall with a solid build and a booming laugh, the kind of guy who filled a room with his energy. Dan had always been a ladies' man, known for his carefree approach to relationships, but he was fiercely loyal to his friends. I knew he'd have my back, no questions asked. When I called him and told him what had happened, he went silent for a moment, and then his voice dropped, serious for once. "Mark, man. I don't even know what to say. That's brutal. You deserve way better than that. If you need anything, you know I'm here." "I know," I replied, feeling a wave of relief. I don't know where to go from here." "Start by letting loose a bit," he said with a chuckle. "Let's hit up O'Malley's tonight. Drinks on me. You've been the responsible guy long enough, time to have a night where you don't hold back." Normally, I'd have turned down the offer, but tonight, I was up for anything that would help me forget. So, I agreed. After work, I headed home, changed into a pair of jeans and a leather jacket, a look Karen had once joked made me look like a wannabe rebel. The thought stung, but I brushed it off. Tonight was about reclaiming some piece of myself she'd chipped away at over the years. When I got to O'Malley's, Dan was already there, sitting at a corner booth with a couple of our mutual friends, Jake and Sarah. Jake was an easygoing guy, short and wiry with a shock of red hair, always cracking jokes and quick to turn any situation into a good time. Sarah, on the other hand, was more reserved. With her dark hair pulled back and dressed in a leather jacket, she had a tough exterior but was known for her fiercely protective nature over her friends. "Here he is." Dan greeted me, standing up to clap me on the back. "Mark, you look like you could use about 10 shots." The others laughed, and soon, we were downing drinks, the initial tension of the night easing up as the alcohol flowed. It felt good, freeing, to be surrounded by friends who weren't going to judge me for feeling shattered. They listened as I told them the whole story, their expressions shifting from shock to anger. "That woman has no idea what she threw away," Sarah said, her voice sharp. "Good riddance. You're better off without her." "Exactly," Jake chimed in, raising his glass. "To new beginnings, my man. To getting rid of the trash." We clinked our glasses, and I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe they were right. Maybe Karen's betrayal was the start of something better. I'd given so much of myself to her, bending over backward to make her happy, doing everything to support her career. I'd trusted her, never questioning her late nights or work trips. And she'd tossed me aside like I was nothing. By the end of the night, I was feeling more than a little buzzed, but it was a good kind of buzz. A liberating one. Dan insisted on walking me home, probably sensing I'd had more than I could handle. As we made our way through the quiet streets, Dan turned to me, his face serious. "Listen, man. You're a good guy, but you need to start looking out for yourself. No more bending over backward for anyone who doesn't respect you. Got it?" "Got it," I mumbled, feeling a mix of gratitude and frustration. I'd been so caught up in the idea of being the perfect husband that I'd forgotten to take care of myself. When I finally made it back to my apartment, I collapsed onto the bed, still wearing my clothes. The events of the past few days played over in my mind, swirling in a haze of hurt and anger. But for the first time, there was a glimmer of something else, too, determination. I was done being the nice guy who let people walk all over him. Karen had taken enough from me. It was time to start living for myself. The weeks that followed that night at O'Malley's were strange. For the first time in years, I wasn't playing the role of someone's partner. I didn't have to check in, worry about anyone's plans, or deal with the never-ending demands Karen had so skillfully imposed over the years. In the mornings, I could pour a cup of coffee, sit in silence, and actually enjoy the taste without hearing her nagging about one thing or another. I'd thrown myself into work. Every day, I was there early and stayed late, determined to channel the storm inside me into something productive. I knew that if I kept busy enough, the pain might dull. My boss, Lisa, started to notice. She was an intense, no-nonsense kind of woman in her 40s, with piercing blue eyes and a sharp bob that added to her air of authority. She wasn't one for small talk, but she stopped by my desk one evening, tapping a perfectly manicured nail on the edge. "Mark," she said, studying me closely, "you've been different lately. You working on something big?" I looked up from my laptop, caught off guard by the attention. "Just keeping busy," I replied, shrugging, hoping she wouldn't press further. Lisa gave a small nod, seemingly satisfied, but there was a glint in her eyes that told me she knew there was more to the story. "Good. Just make sure you're not burning out. If you ever need a hand with anything, let me know." As she walked away, I felt an unexpected sense of relief. My life was in pieces, but at least work gave me something solid, something that didn't shift under my feet. And maybe, just maybe, Lisa's words were the closest thing to support I'd felt since Karen left. By the end of the month, I had settled into a comfortable rhythm. My friends became my lifeline, pulling me out of my shell when I felt myself slipping too deep into the bitterness Karen had left behind. We'd go out most weekends, sometimes to bars, other times to random concerts or game nights at Dan's place. I could feel myself becoming lighter, laughing more, starting to feel like the old Mark, the Mark who wasn't always overshadowed by someone else. One Saturday afternoon, I went for a jog at the local park. It was a sunny, crisp day, with just enough chill in the air to keep the jog pleasant. I just passed the pond, where ducks waddled near the edge, when I heard someone call my name. Turning, I saw Sarah jogging toward me. She looked different outside of our usual bar nights, dressed in running gear with her hair tied up in a ponytail, her face fresh and free of makeup. She was still her usual tough-looking self, but there was a softness to her smile that I hadn't noticed before. "Hey, stranger," she said, catching up to me. "Didn't peg you as a runner." I laughed, slightly out of breath. "It's a new thing. Trying to clear my head, you know." She nodded, falling into step beside me. We jogged in comfortable silence for a few minutes, listening to the sounds of the park, kids laughing in the distance, dogs barking, the occasional swoosh of a cyclist passing by. It felt nice. Peaceful. "You know," she said eventually, breaking the silence, "you're handling all this a lot better than I expected." I gave her a sideways look, eyebrows raised. "You thought I'd be a mess, huh?" She shrugged, smirking. "Well, it's kind of my thing, to read people. I mean, you got blindsided. That's rough. Most people wouldn't be out here jogging in the sunshine, they'd be wallowing at home." "Trust me, there's been plenty of wallowing," I admitted, chuckling. "But there's only so much self-pity I can take." Sarah slowed down, glancing over at the pond. "I've been through my share of crappy relationships too," she said, her voice soft. "The hardest part isn't getting over them. It's getting over who you thought they were." Her words struck a chord. She was right. What hurt most about Karen's betrayal wasn't losing her, it was realizing that the woman I'd loved, the person I'd shared everything with, had been an illusion. I'd spent years loving someone who didn't exist. We finished the jog in silence, the unspoken understanding between us somehow more comforting than any words could have been. As we walked back to the parking lot, Sarah turned to me, her face serious. "Hey, listen. If you ever need someone to talk to, or just someone to shut up and sit with you, I'm here," she said, offering a smile. I nodded, feeling a strange warmth spread through my chest. "Thanks, Sarah. I appreciate it." We said our goodbyes, and I drove home, feeling a little lighter, a little less alone. In that moment, I realized how much I'd relied on Karen for everything, how much of my identity had been wrapped up in being her husband. Now, with her gone, I was discovering pieces of myself that I hadn't even known were missing. But, of course, peace never lasted long. 2 weeks later, I was at work, just wrapping up for the day when my phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled as I opened it. "Mark, please. Just talk to me. I need to explain," the message read. It was Karen. Of course, she didn't even have the decency to call from her own number. I hadn't heard from her since the day she left, and I had no intention of breaking the silence now. I tossed my phone aside, feeling the familiar anger simmering beneath the surface. I wanted nothing to do with her, and yet, there she was, creeping back into my life, trying to claw her way in. Over the next few days, the messages kept coming. She apologized, pleaded, said she was sorry, claimed she'd made a mistake. She tried every tactic: guilt, nostalgia, even anger. But I ignored every single message. I wasn't about to let her twist my life back into the tangled mess it had been before. A few days later, after another round of ignored messages, my phone rang while I was out with Dan and Jake. I glanced at the screen. It was her again. "Are you ever going to answer that?" Jake asked, raising an eyebrow. "No," I said firmly, turning off the phone. But it didn't end there. Karen showed up outside my apartment that Friday evening, pounding on my door like a woman possessed. When I finally opened it, she was standing there, looking tired and desperate, her eyes puffy from crying. She wore the same dress she'd worn to one of our anniversaries, a royal blue number that hugged her curves, the same one she'd laughed in when I'd spilled wine on it years ago. "Mark, please, just hear me out," she begged, her voice shaky. I crossed my arms, blocking the doorway. "What do you want, Karen?" She bit her lip, looking down, then back up at me, tears streaming down her face. "I know I messed up. I don't know what I was thinking. But I'm here now, and I'm ready to make things right." I shook my head, feeling a strange mix of anger and pity. "You made your choice, Karen. I'm not going to let you back into my life just because you suddenly decided you're sorry." "But, Mark, please," she whispered, stepping closer. "We had something real. You know we did." I felt a surge of anger, all the resentment I'd bottled up spilling over. "Real? You cheated on me, Karen. You betrayed me. You don't get to come back here and pretend like none of that happened." She looked like she was about to say something, but I slammed the door in her face, my heart pounding. She kept knocking, pleading, but I ignored her, retreating into my apartment. As I leaned against the door, I knew one thing for sure: Karen had lost her place in my life, and I wasn't about to let her back in. That night, after Karen left, I felt an overwhelming sense of finality. It was as if slamming the door in her face had somehow slammed the door on a painful chapter of my life. But the rush of relief didn't last long. I spent most of the night lying awake, the anger fading into something more complicated, a hollow ache, a mixture of sadness and disbelief that things had turned out this way. The next day, I dragged myself into work, feeling as though I hadn't slept at all. I was used to being on top of things at the office, but my mind was scattered. Even Lisa noticed. She paused by my desk, looking at me with concern. "You doing okay, Mark? You look off," she said, her tone surprisingly gentle. I forced a smile. "Yeah, just, didn't sleep well." Lisa studied me for a moment, her eyes narrowing. "Well, don't push yourself too hard. You're one of our best, but everyone needs a break sometimes." Her words resonated with me. I realized I'd been pushing myself to avoid dealing with the mess Karen had left behind. After work, instead of going home to an empty apartment, I decided to reach out to Dan and Sarah to see if they wanted to grab a drink. I needed the distraction, and I was starting to feel that maybe it was time to let some people back into my life. When I arrived at the bar, Dan and Sarah were already there, sitting in a cozy booth near the back. Dan gave me a huge grin as I slid into the seat across from him. "There he is. I was starting to think you were gonna hole up forever." I chuckled, shaking my head. Not forever. Just, had to get my head straight. Sarah smirked, taking a sip of her beer. Glad you finally decided to join the land of the living. We spent the evening talking and laughing, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could actually breathe. The weight I'd been carrying around felt a little lighter, as if I could finally start seeing a future beyond the mess Karen had left behind. As the night wore on, Dan and Sarah started sharing stories about their own relationships, both the good and the bad. Dan talked about a few exes who'd left him with more baggage than he'd like to admit, while Sarah shared her experiences with a surprising amount of vulnerability. She was usually the tough one, the friend who never let anything rattle her, so seeing this side of her was unexpected but refreshing. It's funny, Sarah said, staring into her drink. People always think I'm this strong, unbreakable person, but I've been burned before. It's just I've learned to hide it better, I guess. I nodded, feeling a strange sense of camaraderie. Guess we all have our scars, huh? Dan grinned, raising his glass. Here's to surviving the wreckage. We clinked our glasses, and I felt a surge of gratitude for these friends who had stood by me through everything. They'd been my anchor in the storm, helping me find my footing when I'd been lost. That night, I realized that I didn't have to carry the weight of Karen's betrayal alone. I had people who cared about me, people who wanted to see me happy and whole. Over the next few weeks, my life began to feel like my own again. I started going to the gym regularly, finding solace in the steady rhythm of the weights, the feel of my muscles burning as I pushed myself harder than ever. It became my sanctuary, a place where I could clear my head and focus on rebuilding myself, physically and mentally. But Karen didn't stay gone for long. One afternoon, as I was leaving the gym, my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen and felt a jolt of annoyance, another message from Karen. I didn't want to read it, but my curiosity got the better of me. Mark, please. I know I messed up, but I'm willing to do anything to fix this. Just give me a chance to explain. I miss you. I clenched my jaw, feeling the familiar anger flare up. It wasn't fair. She'd made her choice, betrayed me in the worst way possible, and now she wanted to come crawling back as if an apology could erase the damage she'd done. I was about to delete the message when another one came through. Please, Mark. I'm not the same person anymore. I've changed. I realize now how much I took you for granted. Her words were like salt in an open wound. I didn't reply, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Karen wasn't just going to disappear, and the thought of her lurking in the background of my life was unsettling. That weekend, I invited Sarah over for a casual dinner. She'd become one of my closest confidants, someone I could be completely honest with, and I wanted to catch up without the usual crowd around. We spent the evening cooking together, laughing as we attempted to recreate an overly complicated recipe we'd found online. As we sat down to eat, I found myself telling her about Karen's recent messages. I hadn't planned to bring it up, but Sarah had a way of making me feel comfortable, like I could say anything without being judged. Part of me just wants to tell her off, I admitted, stabbing at my pasta. But another part of me just wants her to leave me alone. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes people like Karen don't understand boundaries. They think they can just waltz back in and everything will be fine. But she's already shown you who she really is, Mark. She's not worth your time. Her words hit me harder than I'd expected. I realized she was right, Karen wasn't worth my time. She'd broken my trust, shattered my heart, and left me to pick up the pieces. I didn't owe her anything, not even the courtesy of a response. After dinner, Sarah and I settled onto the couch, talking about everything and nothing. It felt easy, natural. She didn't cry or offer empty platitudes, she just listened, letting me get things off my chest at my own pace. At one point, we both drifted off, and I woke up with my head resting on her shoulder. For a moment, I felt a pang of embarrassment, but when she opened her eyes and smiled, I realized I didn't mind. As the days passed, Karen's messages became more desperate, veering from apologies to anger, as if she couldn't decide how to manipulate me into responding. But I stayed silent, refusing to let her drag me back into the chaos. One evening, I received a call from an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something told me to answer. A rough voice on the other end asked, "Is this Mark?" "Yes, who's this?" I replied, my heart pounding. The man introduced himself as Steve, Karen's boss. The man she'd cheated on me with. The shock was like a punch to the gut, and I could barely process his words as he continued talking. "Listen," he said, his tone rough and unapologetic. "I don't know what she told you, but she's been a mess since you kicked her out. Keeps talking about you, begging to come back. It's pathetic." Hearing him say those words sent a rush of anger through me. This was the guy who had played a part in destroying my marriage, and now he had the audacity to call me, as if he expected me to care about Karen's problems. "What do you want, Steve?" I said, my voice cold. He chuckled, the sound grating in my ears. "Just thought you'd like to know that she's not exactly loyal. She's been trying to get back with me too, but, well, I'm done with her." I felt a grim satisfaction knowing she'd been left in the dust, but it didn't make up for the damage she'd caused. "I don't care what she does, Steve. She's your problem now." I hung up before he could respond, feeling a strange sense of closure. Karen's life was unraveling, but I was finally free from her grasp. For the first time in months, I felt like I was on solid ground, ready to start a new chapter on my own terms. The days following Steve's call were strangely peaceful. The knowledge that Karen was spiraling somehow felt like a weight had been lifted from my chest. It was as though I'd been holding my breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop, and now I could finally exhale. I'd blocked her number, deleted her messages, and removed every trace of her from my life. For the first time in years, my focus was on myself, my own happiness, and the things that truly mattered. Sarah was a huge part of that newfound peace. Our casual dinners had turned into weekly get-togethers, a ritual I looked forward to with a sense of anticipation I hadn't felt in years. She brought a kind of ease into my life, a refreshing honesty that reminded me of what it meant to feel comfortable around someone. We didn't need to put on airs or hide our flaws, we could just be ourselves, flaws and all. One evening, Sarah invited me over to her place for a movie night. Her apartment was cozy, filled with plants she'd lovingly nurtured, shelves packed with books, and soft, warm lighting that made the whole place feel inviting. I couldn't help but smile as she fussed over a selection of snacks, laying out chips, popcorn, and a few of her favorite craft beers. "So, horror or rom-com?" she asked, grinning mischievously as she held up 2 DVDs. I chuckled. "I'm good with whatever you pick. You have better taste in movies than I do, anyway." She laughed, shaking her head. "That's not saying much. I remember you telling me you thought Transformers was a masterpiece of storytelling." "Hey, it was groundbreaking at the time," I protested, laughing along with her. We ended up watching a thriller, and before I knew it, I was fully engrossed in the movie, and in Sarah's presence. As the night went on, I found myself stealing glances at her, captivated by the way she laughed at the suspenseful moments, her eyes bright with excitement. It was as if something inside me had awakened, something I hadn't felt in a long time. I realized I was genuinely happy, not just pretending or trying to force myself into some semblance of normalcy. I was enjoying the moment, savoring it for what it was. After the movie ended, we sat there in comfortable silence, sipping our beers. I glanced at her, feeling the urge to say something, but unsure of how to put my feelings into words. Luckily, Sarah seemed to sense my hesitation. "You know," she began, her voice soft, "I'm glad you're finally letting yourself enjoy life again. You deserve this, Mark. You really do." Her words touched me more deeply than I could express. I reached out, taking her hand in mine. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like the beginning of something profound. We sat there, hand in hand, not needing to say anything. In that moment, I knew that whatever lay ahead, I was ready to face it. The peace I'd found, however, wasn't destined to last without disruption. About a week after that night with Sarah, I started noticing someone lurking around my building. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, maybe just a neighbor's friend or someone waiting for a ride. But then I saw the unmistakable figure of Karen, leaning against a car parked just across the street, watching my apartment with an intensity that sent a chill down my spine. She looked haggard, disheveled, and worn down, a shadow of the woman she'd once been. Gone was the polished image she'd cultivated for so long. Now she looked almost unrecognizable, like someone barely holding onto the fragments of her life. I ignored her presence, hoping she'd get the message and leave. But she was relentless, waiting there for hours, occasionally pacing, as if debating whether to come up to my door. The sight of her rattled me in a way I hadn't anticipated. I thought I'd moved on, left her behind in the ashes of our marriage. But seeing her there brought back a rush of emotions I wasn't prepared for: anger, pity, and a strange sense of finality. When she didn't leave, I decided enough was enough. I marched out of my apartment and across the street, stopping a few feet away from her. She looked up, her eyes widening in surprise, but there was a glimmer of desperation in her gaze that told me she hadn't come to make amends. She was here for something else, something I wasn't willing to give. "Karen," I said, keeping my voice firm. "What are you doing here?" She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her eyes filled with tears, and she took a shaky breath, looking away as if unable to face me. "Mark. I don't have anyone else," she finally whispered. "Steve threw me out, my friends stopped talking to me. I don't know where to go." Her vulnerability might have once tugged at my heartstrings, but now all I felt was a cold detachment. I was no longer her safety net, no longer the man who would drop everything to pick up the pieces of her mistakes. "That's not my problem, Karen," I replied, my tone unyielding. "You made your choices, and now you have to live with them. I'm not here to save you." She flinched, as if I'd slapped her, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of anger in her eyes. But then it faded, replaced by a resigned sadness that somehow felt hollow. "Mark, please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I want a second chance." I shook my head, feeling the weight of all the years we'd spent together, all the memories that had once felt so meaningful. "Karen, there's nothing left between us. You broke my trust, and you can't just undo that." Her face crumpled, and she turned away, wiping her eyes as if trying to gather the remnants of her dignity. I watched her go, feeling a strange mix of relief and finality. It was truly over. Whatever illusions I'd once held on to were gone, replaced by the clear reality of who she'd become. Over the following weeks, Karen's presence began to fade, like a bad memory slowly dissolving into the past. I found myself focusing more on the things that mattered: my work, my friendships, and my growing connection with Sarah. It was a time of rebuilding, of reclaiming the parts of myself I'd lost along the way. One evening, Sarah and I went for a walk through the city, the streets alive with the hum of activity. We talked about everything and nothing, sharing stories from our lives, laughing at the silly things that had once felt so important. She told me about her dream to travel, to see the world and experience life beyond the confines of the city. I listened, captivated by the passion in her voice, feeling inspired by her zest for life. As we reached a quiet spot overlooking the city skyline, I turned to her, feeling a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in years. "Sarah," I began, my voice soft, "I don't know where this is going, but I want to see where it leads. With you." She looked at me, her eyes shining with a mixture of surprise and joy. "I'd like that, Mark. I really would." We stood there, side by side, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, a silent promise of new beginnings and uncharted paths. For the first time in a long time, I felt whole, ready to embrace whatever the future had in store. And as for Karen, she was a chapter I'd finally closed, a painful lesson that had ultimately led me to this moment. I didn't know what lay ahead, but I knew one thing for certain: I was finally free, and I was ready to start living my life on my own terms. The weeks following my confrontation with Karen passed in a blur of newfound freedom and self-discovery. Every day felt like a fresh start, a chance to define who I was outside of my marriage, outside of the pain. Sarah became my anchor in this new world. Her easy laughter, her caring nature, and the light she brought into my life gave me something to look forward to. It wasn't just her presence, though. I found that, with her, I was more myself than I'd ever been, unguarded and unafraid. We'd settled into a rhythm together. Movie nights at her place, long walks around the city, weekend hikes in the mountains, where we'd breathe in the crisp air and talk about everything and nothing. Each moment felt more precious than the last, and I knew that what I was building with Sarah wasn't just a rebound. It was real. One Saturday afternoon, we decided to drive out to a small lake 2 hours outside the city. Sarah had found a secluded spot she said was perfect for a picnic, and we'd spent the whole drive laughing and joking, music blasting in the car as we wound through tree-lined roads. We laid out a blanket by the water, and as we ate and shared stories, I realized how easy it had become to let go of my past with Karen. "Mark," Sarah said suddenly, pulling me from my thoughts. Her eyes were fixed on the water, her expression serious. "What would you do if she, tried to come back again?" I sighed, looking out at the gentle ripples on the lake. It wasn't a question I wanted to answer, but I knew I owed Sarah my honesty. I'd tell her it's over. I'd make it clear that I've moved on. Sarah nodded, her hand finding mine. "I hope so. You deserve to be happy, Mark. I know what she did left a scar, but you're stronger than that." I squeezed her hand, feeling a surge of gratitude. "With you, I know I am." We stayed by the lake until the sun began to set, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink. I felt a peace that had been foreign to me for so long, and as I held Sarah's hand, I realized that I was finally free. It was a few days later when the shadows from my past returned to haunt me. I was at work, immersed in a project, when my phone buzzed on my desk. I glanced at it, my heart skipping a beat as Karen's name flashed on the screen. Despite everything, part of me still reacted to her presence, a residual instinct I couldn't quite shake. I hesitated, then answered, my voice hard and unyielding. "What do you want, Karen?" Her voice was shaky, barely a whisper. "Mark. I'm sorry. I know I messed up. I need to see you. Please, just one last time." I closed my eyes, fighting the wave of irritation rising within me. "Karen, we're done. I've moved on. You should, too." "But I can't, Mark," she pleaded. "Please. I just need closure. Can you meet me for a coffee? Just 5 minutes." Her words tugged at me, but not in the way they once might have. This wasn't about guilt or nostalgia, it was about putting an end to something that should have been over long ago. After a long pause, I agreed, setting a time and place in a nearby cafe. I figured a few minutes couldn't hurt, and maybe it would give me a chance to finally close this chapter for good. When I arrived at the cafe the next morning, Karen was already there, waiting by the window. She looked different, thinner, her face pale and drawn, as though the last few months had drained the life out of her. I almost felt a pang of pity, but I reminded myself of the lies, the betrayal, the nights I'd spent questioning everything because of her. "Mark," she greeted, her voice soft. She attempted a weak smile, but I could see the regret in her eyes. "Thank you for coming." I took a seat across from her, keeping my expression neutral. "What is it, Karen?" She looked down at her hands, twisting her fingers nervously. "I know I messed up. I know I hurt you in ways I can't take back. But I thought that maybe, if I explained myself, you'd understand." We could find a way to move forward. I clenched my jaw, struggling to keep my anger in check. Karen, there's nothing to understand. You chose someone else. You lied to me, betrayed me. There's no moving forward from that. Tears filled her eyes, and she reached across the table, her hand brushing mine. I pulled back, feeling a surge of revulsion. The Karen I'd once loved was gone, replaced by a stranger desperate to cling to something she'd destroyed. Mark, please, she whispered. I know it's too late, but I miss you. I miss what we had. I stood up, refusing to be drawn back into her web. What we had is gone, Karen. You chose to end it, and now I've chosen to move on. It's over. Her face crumpled, and she sobbed quietly, not even trying to hide her desperation. Part of me wanted to feel sorry for her, but I reminded myself of the strength I'd found, the life I'd built with Sarah. I turned and walked away, leaving Karen to the consequences of her choices. I returned to my apartment, feeling both liberated and exhausted. The encounter with Karen had dredged up emotions I'd thought were buried, but it also reinforced my decision to move forward. Sarah met me at my place that evening, her presence a soothing balm on my frayed nerves. She listened as I recounted the encounter, her hand resting on mine, grounding me. She's just trying to hold on to something that's gone, Sarah said, her voice steady. But you've moved on, Mark. You're building a new life, and she's not part of it anymore. I nodded, feeling the weight of her words sink in. You're right. I'm done with the past. It's time to focus on what's ahead. That night, as I held Sarah close, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known was possible. Karen was a part of my past, a painful chapter I'd finally closed. And with Sarah by my side, I was ready to face the future, free from the shadows that had once haunted me. A few weeks had passed since my meeting with Karen in the cafe. Life felt settled, as if I'd finally turned a corner. With each day, Sarah and I grew closer, and I felt more grateful than ever for her steady, reassuring presence. My past with Karen no longer loomed over me like a storm cloud, it felt distant, like a life that didn't even belong to me anymore. Little did I know, though, that Karen wasn't finished with her attempts to pull me back into that past. One Saturday afternoon, as Sarah and I were planning a trip, my phone buzzed. It was an unknown number, and I ignored it, assuming it was another spam call. But then it buzzed again. And again. I finally answered, bracing myself for a telemarketer's pitch, but instead, a familiar voice drifted through the line. Mark, Karen's voice was unmistakable, low and urgent. I felt my stomach knot. I'd blocked her number after the cafe incident, determined to cut ties, but somehow, she'd found a way to reach me again. I immediately considered hanging up, but something stopped me. I could hear a note of desperation in her voice, a kind of raw panic that unsettled me. What do you want, Karen? I asked, my tone hard, almost impatient. I need your help, she whispered, her voice cracking. Please, I have no one else to turn to. I let out a slow breath, torn between wanting to ignore her and the nagging guilt I couldn't quite shake. I'd told myself I'd moved on, that she was no longer my concern, but something about her plea stirred an old sense of responsibility. What's wrong? I asked reluctantly. There was a pause, and then she explained, her voice trembling. She'd fallen into trouble at work. Apparently, her boss, who she'd been involved with, had been exposed for financial misconduct. Not only had he been skimming funds from the company, but he'd also left Karen implicated. She was now under investigation, her life upended, her career in shambles. I didn't know, Mark, she insisted, her voice barely a whisper. I trusted him, and now I'm losing everything. A surge of conflicting emotions washed over me, pity, anger, and a flicker of satisfaction. She had chosen this path, had made her bed. But I knew that if I let her fall without offering some help, I'd carry the weight of that decision with me. Karen, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I'm sorry you're going through this, but I don't know how I can help." She let out a small sob, barely audible. "I just needed to talk to someone who understands me. I thought maybe you'd still care." Her words stung, twisting the knife in wounds I'd thought were healed. This was a part of me she'd held on to, a part she still believed was hers to exploit. I knew then that I had to make it clear, for both our sakes, that the Mark who once would have dropped everything to help her was gone. "I moved on, Karen," I said firmly. "I'm with someone who treats me right, who respects me. You need to accept that I'm not in your life anymore." There was silence on the other end, and for a moment, I wondered if she'd hung up. But then she spoke, her voice a mixture of pain and bitterness. "I hope she's worth it," she said coldly, before ending the call. I sat there for a moment, the weight of the conversation settling over me. I realized that I felt nothing but relief. Her chaos, her choices, her manipulation, they were all part of a world I was no longer bound to. I looked over at Sarah, who'd been watching me with quiet concern, and gave her a reassuring smile. Returning to the city after that transformative weekend with Sarah felt like emerging from a cocoon. Everything felt different, lighter. The weight I'd carried from my relationship with Karen had lifted, and I could feel myself fully invested in this new chapter of my life. Sarah had shown me what it meant to be truly supported and cherished. As the days went by, our bond grew stronger. I finally understood what a real partnership felt like, one built on mutual respect, trust, and understanding. It was a stark contrast to the chaotic, roller coaster relationship I'd had with Karen. There were no dramatic fights, no secrets, no feelings of insecurity or betrayal. With Sarah, I felt at home. But just as I began to fully embrace my new life, Karen made a final, desperate attempt to claw her way back into it. It started with a knock on my door late one evening. I was surprised, given that no one usually visited unannounced, and I had a sinking feeling as I walked toward the door. When I opened it, there she was, Karen, looking disheveled and distraught. Her eyes were red, as if she'd been crying for hours, and she seemed smaller somehow, weighed down by whatever had brought her to my doorstep. "Mark, I need you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I stared at her, feeling a mixture of shock, anger, and pity. I hadn't expected to see her again, especially not like this. But I quickly reminded myself of the boundaries I'd set, the decision I'd made to move on. "Karen, we've talked about this. You can't keep showing up like this. You need to let me go." She broke down, sobbing openly. "I don't have anyone else. He left me, Mark. I lost my job, my friends, everything. I don't know where to go or what to do." Her words struck a chord, and despite everything, I felt a twinge of sympathy. Part of me still felt responsible, still wanted to help. But I knew I couldn't allow her to drag me back into the past. The life I was building with Sarah was too important to jeopardize. "I'm sorry, Karen," I said, my voice firm. "But you made your choices, and now you have to live with them. I can't save you from this." She looked at me, her face twisted in pain and disbelief. "I thought you loved me. I thought you'd be there for me, no matter what." I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "I did love you, Karen. But that love ended the day you betrayed me. You took everything I gave you and threw it away. And I've moved on." She shook her head, the tears streaming down her face. "Please, Mark. Just let me in for a little while. I have nowhere else to go." But I stood my ground, determined not to let her back into my life. I had come too far, healed too much, to allow her to undo everything. "Karen, it's time for you to leave. Find someone else to help you. I'm not that person anymore." She stared at me for a long moment, as if realizing for the first time that I was truly gone. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. After Karen left, I called Sarah, who listened patiently as I recounted the encounter. She didn't say much, but her quiet presence on the other end of the line was all I needed to feel grounded again. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, her voice full of concern. "I am," I replied, surprising myself with the certainty in my own voice. "I finally feel free." She laughed gently. "I'm proud of you, Mark. You've come a long way." And she was right. I had come a long way. I'd faced my past, dealt with the hurt, and found the strength to move forward. Now, I was ready to embrace the future with open arms. In the days that followed, I heard nothing more from Karen. It was as if she'd finally accepted that I was gone and had stopped trying to reach me. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace. I focused on my work, deepened my connection with Sarah, and began planning a future that was no longer haunted by the shadows of my past. One evening, as Sarah and I were walking through the park, she took my hand and looked at me, a mischievous smile playing on her lips. "So," she said, "have you thought about what's next for us?" I looked at her, feeling a surge of happiness I hadn't known was possible. "Yeah," I said, squeezing her hand. "I think I'm ready to find out." It had been a few months since Karen had tried to make her last desperate plea, and in that time, life had become something I had only dared to dream of before. The darkness of the past had receded into the distance, replaced by a sense of clarity I never thought possible. I could breathe without feeling the weight of betrayal hanging over me. I could love again without the constant fear that someone would rip it away. Sarah and I were closer than ever. We had moved in together, into a small, cozy apartment with large windows that let in the golden light of the afternoon sun. The place was ours, and it felt like home. We spent weekends traveling, exploring new places, and during the weekdays, we'd sit together at the kitchen table, sipping coffee, discussing our future, and planning the life we were building. There was peace in the simplicity of it all. No more dramatic confrontations, no more wondering if I was loved or if I was worth fighting for. Sarah made me feel like I was enough, just as I was. I wasn't haunted by the ghosts of my past, but I did occasionally find myself thinking about the man I had been before. The one who had been fooled, broken, and lost. That man was gone, though. He was a stranger now. One evening, as I was sitting in the living room reading a book, my phone buzzed on the coffee table. I glanced at the screen, half expecting another spam call, but my heart skipped a beat when I saw the name. It was Karen. I didn't know why I picked up the phone. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was a fleeting sense of responsibility. But when I answered, there was a noticeable tension in her voice, one that I hadn't heard in months. "Mark," she said, her voice shaky, "I just wanted to check in, see how you're doing." I hesitated. I didn't owe her anything, but part of me still cared, maybe out of habit. But I knew this was the moment I needed to prove that I was truly done with her, done with the mess she had brought into my life. "I'm doing great, Karen," I said firmly. "I'm happy. I've moved on." I could hear her take a deep breath, as if gathering the strength to say something. "Mark, I know I've messed up. I hurt you, and I regret it every single day. But I need you to know that I've changed. I'm not the same person I was back then." I laughed, but it was devoid of humor. "That's the problem, Karen. You keep telling yourself that. But the truth is, it doesn't matter. What you did to me, to us, can't just be erased with words. You can't just expect me to forget everything and go back to being your safety net." She was silent for a long time. Then, in a quiet voice, she asked, "Are you happy?" I took a deep breath. "Yes. I am. And I've found someone who treats me the way I deserve to be treated." There was a long pause, and then I heard her voice crack again, like a broken record. "I never thought you'd move on so quickly. I thought you'd always come back." The sadness in her voice hit me harder than I expected. I felt a pang of sympathy, but it was fleeting. No, Karen. I didn't move on quickly. It took time. But you made sure that the only way forward for me was without you. The finality in my voice must have gotten through to her. She didn't respond immediately, and I thought maybe she had finally understood. I hope you find peace, Karen, I said softly. But I won't be a part of it anymore. I ended the call before she could say anything else. The next morning, as I sat at the kitchen table with Sarah, I told her about the phone call. She listened quietly, her eyes soft and understanding. When I finished, she squeezed my hand. "You're so strong, Mark," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "I'm proud of you for sticking to your decision." I smiled at her, grateful for her unwavering support. It's easy when I have you by my side. Months passed, and life became more and more fulfilling. The more I gave myself to Sarah and to our future, the more I realized how far I had come. I no longer feared the past or the people who had hurt me. The future, with Sarah, was mine to shape. One evening, as we sat in front of the fireplace, Sarah turned to me with a mischievous grin. "You know," she said, "I think it's time to take the next step." My heart skipped a beat. I had been wondering when this moment would come. I had known for a long time that I wanted to spend the rest of my life with Sarah, but hearing her say it out loud made everything feel real. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to hide the excitement in my voice. She leaned closer, her lips brushing against my ear as she whispered, "I think it's time we got married." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I had dreamed of this moment for so long, but hearing her speak the words made everything feel surreal. Slowly, I turned to her, my hand reaching for hers. "Are you serious?" I asked, my voice hoarse with emotion. She smiled, her eyes sparkling. "I'm more than serious." In that moment, I knew that the chapter with Karen had ended for good. I had finally found peace, closure, and something real. And with Sarah, the future looked brighter than I could ever have imagined. The wedding was small but perfect. It was exactly the way we wanted it, intimate, surrounded by a few close friends and family members who had supported us from the beginning. The ceremony was held in a small, charming church on the outskirts of the city, and when Sarah walked down the aisle, my heart swelled with emotion. I had never been more certain of anything in my life. As we exchanged vows, I couldn't help but think of how far I'd come, from the broken man who had been betrayed, to the man standing here today, about to marry the love of his life. We left the church as husband and wife, and as we drove off toward our new life, I realized that I was finally, truly home. The past no longer defined me. It no longer controlled my future. I had broken free. And with Sarah by my side, I knew that I was ready for whatever came next.